afternoon. My name is Chad Dion Lassiter. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and I'm excited to be here this afternoon to invite you into PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. We're really excited to have a civil rights legend among us, Stella Adams, who is National Fair Housing activist and owner of SJ Consultant. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be on the show with you, Chad, and this is a very exciting opportunity.
Thank you for having the commitments that you had put off to the side to accommodate us today for our show. We know that you're very busy. Let's jump right into PHR Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. How did you get involved in the fair housing movement, and what shaped you from an advocacy standpoint to go in this social justice direction?
Well, I believe social justice is a family tradition, and I primarily am the daughter of the movement. My grandfather was a civil rights pioneer in Philadelphia, actually.
Wow.
And he was in the 1930s and 40s. He was an evangelist, and he spoke about racial justice on a panel with Joe Louis, the boxer.
Wow.
And I have the I didn't think to bring that advertisement out to show to you. But so that was my grandfather. My grandmother was the first Black journalist at a white newspaper in the Zebulon Record. And my mother was the first Black school teacher in Wake County, North Carolina, when schools integrated. So it was just my turn. And we were also the first Black family to integrate our neighborhoods. So that's why fair housing became my direction, because of the discrimination that we received once we entered the neighborhood. They had a pool and they had a pool and a tennis court that members of the homeowners association were entitled to participate in. Once we moved in and two other Black families, they voted to make it a private club.
Wow.
That was racially exclusive. So fair housing's kind of been with me since I was 10 years old.
Wow, wow, wow. For our viewing audience, what is fair housing, and why was the Fair Housing Act so extremely important during that historical juncture in time?
So when I think of the Fair Housing Act is the right of a person to live in the housing of their choice as long as they can afford to do so. And the Fair Housing Act was originally part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it was just, no, it never took, it was taken out. It was the only piece of that massive legislation that was taken, not passed in 1964. And so Martin Luther King went all over the nation, went to Chicago to fight for housing discrimination. He had never seen, he lived in a tenement in Chicago for 30 days to show what the housing discrimination was like. And so after the death of Martin Luther King, it took blood. Every step we have made as a people has required a blood sacrifice. And he died, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the Fair Housing Act, was passed within 11 days of his death. And so that's why it's so important to me. And functionally the type of deep segregation that he fought for and the Fair Housing Act is intended to eliminate is still in place, and we still have so much work to do, even some 50 years later.
And I'm glad you positioned King in the manner that you did, because a lot of people miss that aspect of history as it relates to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that he saw poverty in the South for certain because he was socialized in the South. But when he comes up to Chicago, he sees poverty in the North, and he's able to see the intersectionality, as well as this whole aspect of kind of like an American apartheid state, segregation, living in the tenement square spaces that he did. And that also shaped him with regards to advocacy around fair housing. I'm glad that you mentioned that. So when we look at that, what needs to occur with regards to fair housing to succeed in the 21st century, the moment that we find ourselves in? What are some of those things that you think need to actually occur?
So we really need to start looking at fair housing, not just as on the individual basis, but really dismantling the structural economic violence that occurs based on neighborhoods. By your zip code, I can tell you what your future is going to be. I can tell you what your health is going to be, what the likelihood that you live in an area of environmental hazards. I can tell what the level of education your children will achieve before they're even born. And so as long as we can do this, right, as long as that is a predeterminant of health, we can't change the broader pattern. We have to be able to fight this structural economic violence that is and dismantle, and we have to change this we have to understand the intent of the law, which was for an integrated society, not a desegregated society.
Certainly. And I think for our viewing audience, could you just add a little bit more to that, to expand it, that when we're looking at fair housing, it just doesn't trend on one side of the color line, that whites have also been impacted and minorities as well have been impacted by segregation around housing. Could you speak a little bit to that? Because I think sometimes when people hear things like the Fair Housing Act and gentrification, redlining, predatory lending, they tend to think that it only happens to a certain segment of the population as well.
So it does. So there's some interesting things about discrimination, right? So I talk about fair housing. I'm not one of those people who talks about affordable housing, because that's not the same thing, okay? The Black community is an hourglass, not a parabola. I'm gonna teach some math while we're doing this.
Okay.
So a parabola goes sort of like this, right? It's a big curve. And so you have some poor, some rich, and then you have a fat middle class, right? Mm-hmm. But the Black community is 40% really well-to-do, no middle class to say so, and the poor. So it's a curvy thing, right? So you have a lot of African Americans who are doing really, really well economically, and you have a lot of African Americans who are just hanging on, right? But you don't have that fat, stabilizing middle class.
Yes.
And so African Americans are disproportionately low and moderate income, but they are not the majority of low and moderate income people in the country. If you look at our community, right, based on what the other communities look like, we're disproportionately middle and upper income, and we're disproportionately low and moderate income as a community. But everybody focuses so much on the disproportionately low and moderate, as we should, right?
Yeah.
That the other part of that story gets missed. And so I always say to folks, if it was an affordable housing issue, you'd have whites who are low income and blacks who are low income living in the same neighborhoods. And the fact is they don't. It's not an income issue. It's a race issue.
Certainly. Certainly.
And
Thank you for. No, that was great. I like the way you actually parsed that out. Why are the attacks with regards to fair housing continuous? You know, when you look at the Fair Housing Act, and when we're talking about aspects of affirmatively affirming fair housing, why are these attacks continuous in the very moment that we find ourselves, in your expert opinion?
Because they are systemic and baked. We have baked in ideas and baked in policies. The discrimination that we face in housing originated with the federal government and the Homeowners Loan Corporation and a man named Frederick Babcock, who was an avowed racist, who was over the Federal Housing Administration in its infancy. And he and a man named Homer Hoyt developed a hierarchy of who you could make loans to.
Wow.
So in good times, you could maybe get down to the black people on the list because we were second to last. Hispanic, Mexicans were at the bottom. So you had white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were at the top of the list. And then your other kind of, and then white Catholics, and then for some reason, Lithuanians and Romanians were broke out. Then you had your Northern Italians who were separated from the Southern Italians. So the top five ended with the Northern Italians. And then you got the bottom five, which I can't remember the order of the three, but you had Jewish, Greeks, and Southern Italians, blacks, and Mexicans were in that bottom tier. And so green was the top five. You could lend to them, they were green. And then the Hispanics and African American, you had a yellow zone, and then you had a red line, and we were red line. That's where the term comes from. The maps that they developed around this hierarchy of worthiness scale. So then that got baked in. But these were also rehabilitation loans, right? And rehabilitation loans, you own your home, or you own a substantial portion of your home. You just want to keep your home up. So we were locked out of getting those loans. So then our houses became in disrepair, right? And then that created the vision that Black folks don't know how to take care of their homes. That's why you don't want them neighbors. But again, it was based on public policy.
Yeah.
Public policy, Frederick Babcock also ended up being the head of the VA and VA loans. So he integrated those policies there. So when the GI Bill came, okay, those who were GIs, white GIs got access to GI home loans. Black GIs, they built public housing. They built Cabrini Green. They built these public housing to provide housing for Black GIs.
Cabrini Green in Chicago. Okay.
They, I'm just giving you samples, right? You have Lovett-Town for white folks, Cabrini Green for Black folks. The one part of the GI Bill that was available to all GIs was the education portion. But African Americans were limited to going to HBCUs or trade schools. And these trade schools are very much like these predatory trade schools we have today. They offered you a worthless education, but they ate up all of your benefit without you benefiting. It's the same scam today that started back then.
This is the structural inequality.
This is structural economic violence against our community that continues to be perpetrated. And it continues to be perpetuated. And it's baked into our society now. So now the vision that the white GIs who serve with the black GI is like, well, I got my home, why didn't he get his?
Yeah.
Well, my house is nice, but his isn't. And so then that baked in, you don't want to live with too many African Americans. Your home values are going to go down. There is there's a place in North Carolina, Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and the railroad track divides the city into two counties. One county is predominantly white, and the other county is predominantly black, and the railroad track through the city goes right there. You can have the same structure on one side of the track and the other side of the track, and that's the structure. The house is identical to the neighbor across the track, and the value of the house is 20% less.
Wow.
That's the baked in, so it compounds itself, and we have to recognize it and then unmask those kinds of things to create new models of peace and opportunity.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you were able to bring some context to that, because it reminds me of the seminal work of Ira Katz Nelson in his book When Affirmative Action Was White. And how
it's been white a long time.
Now the GI Bill has actually helped a lot of individuals. You take an institution like University of Penn, who is part of the Ivies, but was a sleeper commuter college here in Philadelphia, and the GI Bill actually gave access to that and created a pathway for a lot of people into the upper echelon of the Ivy League universities, where traditionally it was Harvard University for certain, Princeton, Columbia University. So for me, I'm always looking at how do we train the next generation of advocates? And, so my question now becomes, how can we train more housing advocates in the space of fair housing? And just really briefly, what does that look like?
So we've got to bring in some of these young activists that we see and get them to work. We're looking for different types of people than we had in the past. So we need people who are computer scientists and can understand how algorithms and can discern algorithmic discrimination, because it's not that if you put garbage into a computer system, you get garbage out. And so all of these inequities that I have described to you are also baked into the logic marvels of these computers. So we need young computer scientists who will maybe as PhD studies, because you can, really weigh in and make this study of how banking, which is now digital primarily, how be able to identify the algorithms and the methodologies behind the design that create these systems, right? You have your Facebooks and your LinkedIn, you have, not LinkedIn, but you have your Facebooks and your Google who have been found to have used these things for advertising purposes so that you could choose which zip codes you don't want to market to. And zip codes, because we're such a segregated society, You can identify characteristics by a zip code. Just this week, Google announced that it was no longer going to allow advertisers to limit themselves based on zip code. So that is an extremely powerful choice. And that's that's one place where we absolutely need to get new younger voices. The other place where we need to get new folks is in the education and outreach area to really
Tell me about that.
So we need folks who understand, history majors, people who understand history, people who can share passionately what does civil rights look like, what does housing discrimination look like, but more importantly, what does an fully integrated society based on equality of opportunity, not equal opportunity, but equity of opportunity and equality of opportunity look like? We need to be thinking about equity, not equal. Because if I am 100 years behind, I'm not going to be able to make that up as a society. If you say, okay, starting today, you're equal. We're going to treat you exactly the same today. That does not close that gap.
Certainly.
But an equity society is a society where we make compensations and eliminate barriers to opportunity. And we're talking about an equity opportunity system. We're talking about an equal opportunity system. We don't even have that, but that would be a good start. But to be able to visualize that future and make those changes, the people who were involved in the 60s visualized the success that we have, but they're disappointed that it didn't catch us up. And so hopefully we can build a new generation of leaders that way. We also want to encourage a multicultural, multiracial commitment to equality, equity, and fair housing. We want to make sure that the workforces look like the people they serve and are committed to that vision.
So then, as we get ready to come to a close, one thing that comes to mind is, how do we close the housing disparities by using the Fair Housing Act as an instrument for social justice?
So the Fair Housing Act built into it a social justice instrument. It's at Section 808 of the Fair Housing Act. And
I bet you know it by heart.
You know I do. The duty of anyone who's a recipient of federal funds to affirmatively further fair housing. This means we're not enforcing the law against bad guys, but we're making efforts, right, to eliminate these barriers that I'm talking about, to create this society that I'm talking about. It's already built in. It's already baked into the law. We just don't use it.
Yeah.
Cities and counties who receive federal funds, they do a checklist. They hold a public hearing and say, we did community outreach. They say they have a Section 3 requirement. State and federal government, state and local governments that receive federal funds. There is a law that says that those funds should be spent hiring people where the money is being spent. So if you're building something in Philadelphia's, in West Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia, where he was born and raised, then there should be, if you're building something there, right, then the people who live in West Philadelphia are to be hired to do that work.
Yes.
The small
Right from the
businesses,
community.
the small businesses and businesses that work in that are supposed to be given contracts. That's what it says, but it has a little to the best extent possible. It gives a way out, and then if the way out is you can write a check and send people to workforce development. When you have trained carpenters and trained folks there. And then the other way this law is not fully enforced is that they use day laborers to count on their process instead of extending jobs and extending contracts to local businesses that would support local job opportunities. So if we enforce Section 3, which is a economic development tool built into the law that is an economic tool, not a racially not a racial tool, right? A racial equity tool, but it's an economic equity tool. If we used it, we would be further along. If we invested in the communities as envisioned by 808 of the Fair Housing Act in terms of affirmatively making an effort to change the direction of your community. That is by using the assessment of fair housing tool or conducting a robust, hear me, a robust analysis of impediments study and implementing the fair housing plan, and not just saying we did 10 workshops this year and we made some brochures and we put up we had a Fair Housing Month event.
But actually taking 808 from a theoretical model, which it's not just a theoretical model, it needs to be implemented from a practical application perspective. We have the tool. We have it right there.
Exists.
Yeah, we have it right there with 808 and the blueprint. We just have to actually have the willingness, and not just the willingness, but the fortitude to actually implement it.
Yes.
So as we come to an end, name association. When you hear the word or the words fair housing, and I know it's kind of challenging for all of us to like just put it into one word, but what's the one word that comes to mind when you hear the phraseology fair housing?
Good neighbors.
Stella Adams, I want to thank you for joining us here on PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century, as our first guest. Thank you for what you do for our democracy. And to our viewing audience, please look us up on www.phrc.gov. We have regional offices in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Harrisburg. And if you are the victim of housing discrimination, please feel free to file a complaint online with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We will be back on June 5th, where we will continue the discussion of fair housing in the 21st century with our guest, Lyle Wood, who's the regional director of the Pittsburgh Regional Office, and attorney counsel, one of our attorneys, Morgan Williams. Once again, thank you for tuning in to PHRC Speaks.